Three children woke up on a Sunday morning inside a mountain cabin. They got dressed. They waited for their mom to make breakfast. She never came. Because in the very next room, just feet from where they slept, their mother, their brother, and their brother's friend had been murdered in the night. Bound, beaten, stabbed, strangled. And their 12-year-old sister? She was gone. The men who did this were identified within days. They were questioned, and then told to leave town. They both died free men, never arrested, never charged, never stood in front of a single judge. And the little girl taken from that cabin, her remains weren't found for 3 years. This is the story of Cabin 28, and how a broken system let a family down twice, first on the night they were murdered, and then every single day after. Sue Sharp was 36 years old, and she was finally free. Not financially free, not comfortable. She was renting a small cabin in a rundown mountain resort for $170 a month. But she was free from a marriage that had ground her down for years. Free from a husband who, by all accounts, had made life behind closed doors very difficult for her and her 5 children. In July of 1979, she packed everything she had and drove across the country from Connecticut to Northern California. Her brother Don lived there, and that gave her a place to land. She settled first in a small trailer in Quincy. Then, in the fall of 1980, she moved the family into something bigger, Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort, a quiet, aging community tucked into the Sierra Nevada mountains, about 80 miles north of Sacramento. She had 5 kids with her. John was 15, Sheila was 14, Tina was 12, Ricky was 10, and the youngest, Greg, was just 5 years old. Keddie wasn't glamorous, it was remote. A collection of worn wooden cabins along a mountain road, surrounded by pine trees and not much else. But Sue liked it. She made friends easily. She became close with a woman named Marilyn Smart, who lived 2 cabins down in Cabin 26 with her husband Martin and her son Justin. The 2 women spent a lot of time together, and people who knew them say Sue had become a kind of confidant to Marilyn, someone she could talk to honestly about her marriage, about Martin. That friendship, quiet, ordinary, the kind that forms naturally between neighbors, would become the thread that unraveled everything. The day of the murders started like any other Saturday. In the morning, Sue drove out with Sheila and little Greg to pick up Ricky from baseball tryouts in Quincy. On the way back, they spotted John and his friend Dana Wingate hitchhiking along the road and gave them a ride home. Dana was 17, easygoing, well-liked, the kind of kid everyone's happy to see. A couple of hours later, John and Dana hitched back to Quincy to hang out with friends. They were seen around town that afternoon, normal teenagers on a weekend. As evening came, Sheila packed a small bag and walked next door to Cabin 27 to sleep over with the Seabolt family. She left just after 8 p.m. Sue stayed home with Ricky, Greg, and their neighbor Justin Smart, Martin and Marilyn's son, who had been invited to spend the night. Tina had been watching TV at the Seabolts with Sheila. Around 9:30 p.m. she looked up, asked what time it was, said goodnight, and walked the short distance back to Cabin 28. That was the last time anyone outside that cabin saw Tina Sharp alive. At some point later that night, John and Dana came home. Exactly when, nobody knows for certain. A couple in a nearby cabin later told investigators they were woken up around 1:30 in the morning by what sounded like muffled screaming. They couldn't figure out where it was coming from. They went back to sleep. At around 7 a.m. on the morning of April 12th, Sheila Sharp walked home to change before church. She opened the front door of Cabin 28, and she found her family. Sue, John, and Dana were lying on the living room floor. All 3 had been bound, hands and ankles tied with electrical cord and medical tape. They had been stabbed with knives, beaten with a hammer. Dana had been manually strangled to death. The level of violence in that room was described by the first responding deputy as unlike anything he had ever seen. Sheila ran out screaming. Someone from the Seabolt cabin ran to the resort lodge. The sheriff's dispatch received the call at 8:05 a.m. When deputies arrived and searched the rest of the cabin, they made a discovery that only deepened the horror. In the back bedroom, 3 young boys, Ricky, Greg, and Justin Smart, completely unharmed, asleep or close to it. The Seabolts helped them climb out through a bedroom window before they could see what was in the living room. Whoever had been inside cabin 28 that night had walked past that bedroom door and left those boys alone. But Tina, 12-year-old Tina, was not in the cabin, not in her room, not outside, not anywhere. She had been taken. What followed should have been one of the most focused murder investigations in California history. Instead, it became a case study in how badly things can go wrong when the people in charge don't do their jobs. From the very first day, the investigation was plagued with problems. Sheriff Doug Thomas called in the California Department of Justice for assistance, but the DOJ didn't send homicide investigators. They sent 2 agents from the organized crime unit. Nobody ever explained why. It would only make sense later, when the name John Bubiday came up. Evidence was collected but never properly organized. The original case history log, documenting every action, every interview, every lead, disappeared entirely. It has never been recovered. Physical evidence including blood-stained carpet and wall panels was placed into storage, where some of it was later found to have been contaminated after a freezer was accidentally switched off. The composite sketches produced from the eyewitness descriptions were drawn not by a trained forensic artist, not by any of the professionals available through the FBI or DOJ, but by a local volunteer with no artistic ability and no forensic training. No one has ever explained that decision. And then there were the suspects. Martin Smart, Justin's stepfather, 2 cabins away, was brought in for questioning the day after the bodies were found. He told police he had spent the evening at a local bar called Keddie's Back Door, dressed strangely in a 3-piece suit and sunglasses, alongside his wife Marilyn and his friend John Bubiday. He described seeing 2 suspicious men at the bar that night. Men who, as investigators later noted, bore a striking resemblance to himself and Bo. Marilyn told police they had gone home around 11 p.m. She went to bed. Martin and Bo went back to the bar. 2 days after the murders, Bo Bubiday left Plumas County. He was questioned once and released. Nobody stopped him. Nobody followed up. He simply drove away. Martin Smart left shortly after, driving to Reno, Nevada. 3 months into the investigation, Sheriff Doug Thomas resigned and took a job with the Sacramento Department of Justice, the same agency that had been brought in to help solve the case. Sheila Sharp later told CBS Sacramento, "I was told the suspects were told to get out of town. So, to me, that means it was covered up." For 3 years, Tina Sharp existed as a missing persons case. Her family lived in the particular hell of not knowing. No body, no answers, no ability to grieve and move forward. Then on April 22, 1984, 3 years and 11 days after the murders, a man collecting bottles in the woods near Feather Falls in Butte County made a discovery among the trees. A skull, a jawbone, bones, a child's blanket, a blue nylon jacket, a pair of jeans with a missing back pocket. They were confirmed as Tina's remains in June 1984. She had been taken from cabin 28, driven more than 60 miles away, and left in the forest. Based on forensic analysis, she had survived the night of the murders, kept alive for months before she was killed. Because according to what Martin Smart would later tell his counselor, she had seen too much. She could identify them. She was 12 years old. Within hours of the discovery being reported on local news, the Butte County Sheriff's Department received an anonymous phone call. The caller said, "I was watching the news, and they were talking about the girl found at Feather Falls. I was just wondering if you thought of the murder up in Keddie, in Plumas County a couple years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was never found." Whoever made that call knew something specific. They knew Tina was that girl. They knew about Keddie. That call was recorded, sealed in an evidence envelope, and left completely uninvestigated. When investigator Mike Gamberg found it in 2013, the envelope had never been opened. In 32 years, no one had ever even listened to it. Let's talk about what investigators actually had on Martin Smart, because this is where the case stops being a mystery and starts being something else entirely. Within weeks of the murders, Martin Smart sat down with a counselor at a Veterans Administration hospital in Reno, and he confessed. He told the counselor, "I killed the woman and her daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boys." When pressed on why Tina hadn't simply run, he said he had incapacitated her, and that he later had to kill her because she was a witness. She had seen everything. The counselor reported this confession to California authorities. The Department of Justice, the same agency that had sent organized crime agents to the scene and watched the suspects leave town, dismissed it as hearsay. It was never pursued. Then there was the letter. After leaving Keddie, Martin Smart wrote to his wife Marilyn from Reno. In that letter he wrote, "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." That letter was found in a box of unsorted, untouched case files in 2013, 32 years after it was written. It had never been entered into evidence, never analyzed, just sitting in a box. The motive investigators believe drove all of this? Sue Sharp had been encouraging Marilyn to leave Martin, to get out, the same way Sue herself had. Martin found out. And for a controlling, abusive man who felt his marriage slipping away, Sue Sharp became the problem he needed to eliminate. He enlisted Bo Bubiday, who had been sleeping on the Smarts' couch for the 10 days leading up to the murders, and who had known ties to organized crime in Chicago, to help him do it. John and Dana came home that night and walked into the middle of it. They never walked out. And Tina, who woke up or came out of her room and saw what was happening, was taken out the back door. Martin Smart died in the year 2000 from cancer, in his own bed. Bo Bubiday died in 1988. Neither man was ever arrested. Neither man ever spent a single day in prison for what happened in Cabin 28. In 2013, former Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood officially reopened the Keddie case and brought in private investigator Mike Gamberg to start from the beginning. What they found in those old evidence boxes was staggering. Unopened envelopes, unanalyzed evidence, the anonymous phone call tape, the letter, tips that had been received and completely ignored. Gamberg said of the original investigation, "You could take someone just coming out of the academy and they'd have done a better job." In March 2016, a hammer was pulled from a pond near the site where Cabin 28 once stood. It matched the exact description of the hammer Martin Smart had claimed went missing just before the murders. Sheriff Hagwood said it had been placed there deliberately. Then in 2018, the most significant development in decades. DNA recovered from a strip of medical tape used to bind one of the victims was matched to a known living suspect. Not Smart, not Bubiday. Someone else, an accomplice, someone who was there that night, or who helped afterward, and who is still alive. Their identity has never been publicly revealed. Investigators believe the total number of people involved, in the murders themselves, the disposal of evidence, and the abduction of Tina, was more than 2. Sheriff Hagwood said publicly, "We're convinced there are a handful of people who fit those roles who are still alive. We've identified some of them, and we're coming." As of January 2025, a book called Solving Keddie was published by local journalist David Keller, who spent 20 years researching the case and interviewed over 100 people connected to it. The case file at the Plumas County Sheriff's Office remains officially open. No arrests have ever been made. Sue Sharp left everything she knew to give her children a better life. She drove across the country, settled into a small mountain cabin, made friends with her neighbors, and tried to build something quiet and safe. She was 36 years old. Her son John was 15. Dana Wingate, who wasn't even her child, just a boy who happened to be there, was 17. And Tina, 12 years old. She walked back into that cabin at 9:30 on a Saturday night, said goodnight, and was never seen alive again. The men who did this confessed. They wrote letters that read like admissions. They left DNA at the scene. And the system, the people whose job it was to stop them, looked the other way, told them to leave town, filed evidence in boxes and never opened them, and let 2 killers live out the rest of their natural lives untouched. That's not a mystery. That's a failure. A deliberate, inexcusable failure. And somewhere out there, someone connected to what happened that night is still alive, still breathing, still free. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office is still accepting tips at 530-2836-360. There is a $5,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. After 44 years, the Sharp family is still waiting. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, because next week we're going somewhere just as dark.